Okay. Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the first meeting in 2013 of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. Happy New Year to everyone. I'm sure it will be a fruitful year for the committee. This is not the first work that the committee has undertaken this week. We spent a full day in Cumbernauld on Monday, and I'd like to thank the Scottish Wildlife Trust, North Lanarkshire Council, and in particular the good people of Cumbernauld and the other communities in North Lanarkshire that made the effort to engage with us on Monday. I think it was of great benefit, and I hope we can do more of that in the future. So I'd like to thank all of them very much indeed. As usual, can I ask everyone to ensure that they've switched off mobile phones and other electronic equipment, please. And if we move to agenda item 1, which is business and private, can we agree to take agenda items 10, 11, 12 and 13 in private? Are we all agreed? Thank you. Agenda items 2, 3 and 4 are subordinate legislation. Agenda item 2, the Minister for Local Government and Planning will give oral evidence on the affirmative instrument of the Public Service Reform Planning Pre-Application Consultation Scotland Order 2013. In the interest of efficiency, I propose that the committee take evidence at the same time from the Minister on agenda items 3 and 4, which are 2 further affirmative statutory instruments: the Public Service Reform Planning Local Review Procedure Scotland Order 2013 and the Planning Etc. Scotland Act 2006 Supplementary and Consequential Provisions Order 2013. Members have papers setting out the purpose of these affirmative instruments as well as a copy of the instruments themselves. I'd like to welcome Derek Mackay, MSP, Minister for Local Government and Planning, Alan Cameron, Policy Manager, Planning Legislation, and Norman MacLeod, Senior Principal Legal Officer, Scottish Government Legal Directorate. Welcome, gentlemen. Minister, would you like to make some opening remarks, please?
Okay, thank you very much, Convener. I welcome the opportunity to debate the motions on these statutory instruments. The 4 statutory instruments before the committee are part of the Planning Reform Next Steps package, which I announced last March and had some discussion in Parliament just yesterday. These particular proposals are largely technical and apply to the Main Planning Act, with some consequential changes to secondary legislation. On the first of the affirmative SSIs, current statutory requirements for pre-application consultation apply to applications for planning permission for a change in conditions on an existing permission for a major or national development. These are known as Section 42 applications. This draft order would remove the PAC requirements from Section 42 applications for major and national developments. The requirement for pre-application consultation in such cases has been repeatedly highlighted by planning authorities and developers as disproportionate, for example, regarding the time and cost implications of 12 weeks of consultation and holding of public events. It can also be misleading for the public as the application relates only to the conditions, not to the proposal as a whole. While changes to conditions can be a significant issue, it is not the same as considering the totality of a major development. The Section 42 application process itself provides communities and others with a suitable opportunity to make their views known to the planning authority, who are required to give them due consideration before making a decision. Having consulted on the need for change on a number of options, we concluded the proposed amendment would be the most proportionate and straightforward solution. The consultation on precise proposals saw the majority of respondents support these proposals, and I'm happy to take questions on that specific order before moving on to the others.
Are there any questions for the Minister? Mr. Stevenson and then Mrs. Mitchell.
Minister, good morning. Just to ask you whether across the board, abolishing the need for such pre-application consideration, was consideration given to making it discretionary for the local authority rather than taking the power away altogether? Because I think perhaps some of the concerns that have been expressed have focused around that in some instances, and it will, I'm sure, be a minority of instances, the conditions are such a substantial part of the decision-making process that that it is important that there is the fullest consideration by the widest range of people of any variation in conditions.
Mr. Stevenson asked a very pertinent question. Consideration was given to that and other options in the comprehensive consultation, but it was preferred to be both proportionate and clear in our approach, and to create different categories that may require that second round of pre-application consultation would be felt that it would be too complex and unnecessary. Of course, a determining local authority will go through the whole planning process again if that's what's required, if it is a change to conditions that wasn't already in the original conditions. So the full process would be gone through that second time if it was a renewed application to change those conditions. So there would be reconsideration of all those matters at the planning application stage, so people would be aware of that. But we felt that having a standard approach across the country was both proportionate and clear and doesn't add any more clutter to the planning system, which would be unwelcome and unnecessary. And I would remind members again that that approach that we have proposed as our recommendation carried a great deal of support in the consultation.
So therefore, Minister, there is the opportunity through the whole procedure of planning being available in considering the variation of conditions for the public and interested parties to intervene, make their views known and interact with the planning system as if it was the original planning application. So therefore, there is no loss of involvement and opportunity to make views known and interact with the application when such a variation is proposed.
For the purpose of the planning application, yes, but to be clear, for the purpose of the pre-application consultation, no, because the body of the application and conditions has already been determined, but the change that would be involved would be presented in that renewed application, and the normal mechanisms would apply.
But just for clarity, Minister, the pre-application process is about helping the applicant and the planning authority shape what's going to happen, whereas the planning process itself is the process by which decisions are made. And in the circumstances that you're now proposing, there remains that absolute opportunity to interact in the decision-making process for everybody who has an interest.
Oh yes, through the planning system, absolutely, and you're absolutely correct in that the pre-application consultation first time round for these scale of applications will remain, and that will help shape the application and the decisions therefrom.
Margaret Mitchell, then John Wilson, please.
Yes, I wonder if the Minister could give some examples of the type of condition, because as you'll be aware, sometimes a condition is absolutely vital and germane to the application being granted in the first place. Therefore, I would have quite a deal of concern if there was a move to change one of these conditions, which was really, as I say, germane to the application being granted in the first place. So some examples would be good, and also a clear indication of what would happen if it was thought that one of these conditions were, in fact, the subject of a Section 42, where there would be no pre-consultation. Where are the checks and balances, Minister?
Okay, if an application at the moment is so deemed that there's a requirement for flexibility in conditions, that can actually be part of a planning determination right now, that further conditions could be considered. For example, as the members requested, for example, the times of operation could either be determined by the application or left for a future decision. So I suppose hours of operation is one example of a condition that could be changed for a property. Now, either that could be determined at the stage of the original decision or left to further negotiation and agreement with the planning authority and the applicant. What the member, as a Conservative, I'm sure would appreciate is sometimes this requirement for a pre-application consultation second time round can cost between £1,000 and £10,000. And to change just one part of the condition as opposed to the whole planning determination does feel disproportionate. And applicants and stakeholders within the planning system have said that that's disproportionate. So if there was to be a variation, a renewed application of that condition, and that would result in the whole planning system being reenacted to consider that change, and the local authority or the planning authority would have to take all matters into account. So the kind of conditions that might be changed may well be hours of operation or an expectation that would arise as a consequence of the application itself. That's happening at the moment in that key agencies of the government, other partners and planning authorities are reconsidering some planning obligations, say at the moment, in light of the changed economic circumstances from when some planning applications were actually approved in the first place, because economic circumstances have changed, and maybe the kind of planning obligations that would be required may no longer be as appropriate as when a planning application was first determined. But this more focuses on planning conditions.
I fully appreciate, Minister, there has to be a balance here and that there is a good reason for introducing this, but I'm still very concerned it's a carte blanche. And the hours of operation example that you've given me, I'm afraid, doesn't give me much comfort, as that can be sometimes key to a local community deciding whether they can live and compromise with something they were against previously, hours of operation being curtailed, after 5, so that there's the opportunity for families to settle and not be disrupted. So really, I would appreciate it if you could look at this again and say, I understand that sometimes just now there are extenuating circumstances, things change and conditions are varied or maybe even removed. But just to allay fears that this could be a loophole for abuse, could you look at some way of referring something that would be of concern, like hours of operation in certain circumstances?
If I can hopefully answer that query. I think the question here in terms of this order is, what value does a pre-application consultation process add to the overall planning system? And the evidence we have for this kind of change, very little, because many people enter the process of a PAC with the view that they can change the overall application again, as opposed to the questions that are being, or the conditions that are necessarily being changed. I don't think the members should be alarmed by the change, because all the factors that would have been raised in consideration and determination, such as community view and local view on potential bad neighbour or impacts of a decision, would be taken account both in the first place and then returning to the planning application if it was to be reconsidered. So local elected members, those making the decision because of the scale of the decision, would still have to take all those factors into account when deciding whether to allow a change of conditions or not. So it's not as if those factors and those views from the community are dispensed with. It's just that the necessity, the statutory necessity for a pre-application consultation is no longer required. So I hope that we can address any concerns that maybe have been raised earlier in the process or through the planning process itself as part of determination, where it is felt that this was just automatically put in the planning system as a consequence of the 2006 Act, rather than it being seen to be adding any extra value. So hopefully can assure the member there will be safeguards continuing within the planning system.
I just wonder briefly, is there any right of appeal if all of these things do not come to pass in the very rare circumstances there may be a case of that?
Of course, the right of appeal is complex depending on the scale of the application and where the decision has been taken, and this change to the order makes no change to the right of appeal, none whatsoever.
John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. The issue you've raised and you've mentioned twice that I can recall, Minister, you've said that the majority of respondents expressed support for this change. Could you describe where the majority of respondents came from? Were they developers? Were they planning departments? Were they community councils? Were they local organisations, community groups that responded to this proposal to change the legislation?
I'm happy to supply the member with the absolute numbers of who responded. That has all been published in the consultation documents. I can generalise, though, to be more helpful from memory, although the officials are giving me more of the details. But in terms of, I don't know that you want me to go through this. Would you rather I generalise and give you the absolute numbers?
generalise it,
Okay.
Minister?
To generalise, I could say that planning authorities were in agreement with this approach. Developers were broadly, yes, in agreement with this approach, both in quite large numbers. Individuals, it was balanced. Consultants in favour, professional bodies, statutory bodies, balanced and broadly in favour. And in terms of community groups and individual community councils, they were generally in disagreement, I suppose, reflecting some of the concern that they may be losing out on an opportunity to input into the process. Of course, the rights to input into the planning process is still retained. It's just, I suppose, they fear, as Margaret Mitchell has helpfully covered, that they would be missing an opportunity through pre-application consultation. I would argue, however, that there is still very little proportionate value in that being part of the process. But that's the broad responses to the consultation.
I thank the Minister for his response, and it quite clearly has confirmed what I thought it would do, and that is the planning authorities, developers and others with an interest in developments would be generally in favour of this proposal, whereas community groups and community councils would be more concerned about any proposals to change the pre-application consultation, particularly when we're changing conditions in an application that has previously been agreed by the local authority. Could the Minister give an indication of what conditions, changes to conditions, may be subject to a pre-application consultation, or would there be no changes to conditions subject to a pre-application consultation? Because, as Margaret Mitchell's quite clearly indicated, communities do engage at a very early stage in terms of the planning process. They make representation to the council, to the local authority planning department and to the planning committee. But some of these conditions, as Margaret Mitchell indicated, may be times of operation. And I'm not so much worried about the 5 o'clock finish. I'm more worried about the 8 a.m. start that many of these developments actually, where developers come in and say, the original condition was an 8 a.m. start, but then come back and say, well, we're now moving into summer months, can we get a 7 a.m. start? Which is a fundamental change in terms of the conditions applied to the planning application. So would any of conditions or the changes to conditions be subject to public consultation? I'm not so concerned about planning committee or planning authority consultation. I'm more concerned about the public's perception of their right to consultation, guaranteed consultation, on any changes to the conditions that have been set out in relation to a planning application.
Minister.
Well, I would argue that the planning authorities, and because of the nature of the applications and the elected member input, is public engagement. I'm sure Mr Wilson recognises that with his local authority perspective. So I would think that planning authorities would take all the matters you're concerned about into account. But I would pose the question again, what extra value is given by a full pre-application consultation for a change in only part of the application, that full 12-week process that does bring costs to both developers and planning authorities, and whether that's necessary. I entirely understand the point that's made around public engagement, but you don't want to lead them into pre-application consultations under the false illusion that they've been consulted in the full planning application again, when it's only a variation of conditions, which, as I say, would be fully considered by the planning authority with all the usual mechanisms coming into play.
Mr Wilson.
Convener, I'm sure that many community organisations and individuals are well aware that in terms of the consultation and change of conditions to a planning application would be the only issues that would be subject to further consultation. You gave a figure earlier in terms of the additional cost to a developer could be between £1,000 and £2,000. Now, for a 12-week consultation, and I'm taking this much wider, Minister, because what we've got to do as a Parliament and as local authorities have got to bring faith to the planning process to many communities throughout Scotland. And it's the communities throughout Scotland who feel aggrieved and may argue that this change to the regulations is actually a change that actually brings as a developer's charter. That what they may do is actually not put the conditions or full conditions within the original application then come back at a later date and say, we want to change or amend the conditions that have been applied. Therefore, because we know we don't have to go through the pre-consultation, the pre-application consultation process, and therefore basically try to circumvent some of the issues that should be fully discussed by the public before and by local authorities before a decision is made.
I'm sure Mr Wilson would want to reflect on that. Characterisation doesn't reflect the evidence that was presented as part of this consultation, because, for example, planning obligations are often revisited because economic circumstances change or what was deemed to be an appropriate planning consideration is no longer the case. So those kind of revisiting of planning decisions can happen in a number of areas, and it's not necessarily as Mr Wilson has described. That said, not every developer plays by the rules, I think it's fair to say, but taking a more proportionate approach to planning. The cost I gave was just the cost of the process itself. I would indicate to the member that right now, if there's a delay in the planning system, something that's had consent, and then there's the variation of conditions that's been sought, a delay of 12 weeks or more, I mean, that's just the pre-application consultation period, that second time round, could cost the developer substantially more. Now, we may not be interested in the cost to developers, but these are jobs and economic growth, and at this point in economic recovery, surely we should be doing everything we can to try and stimulate the economy whilst being proportionate. So I'm not convinced that it would have the negative consequences that the member suggests when the evidence that we have is simply that it added no value to the planning process, because the kind of concerns that the member has raised would be picked up in the planning process. But certainly those individuals and community councils, not a huge response, I have to say, from those particular numbers, but a response nonetheless. We're concerned that their opportunity to input into this would be somewhat diminished, but I would say that opportunity was diminished in the sense that the pre-application consultation a second time round didn't add value, but I would still expect their views to be taken on board in any planning authority's determination.
As I indicated, Convener, I was trying to express what I believe are the views of many communities throughout Scotland that feel the planning process and the planning system at the present moment disadvantages them in relation to determination of planning applications, and in this situation in terms of any changes to conditions of planning, then some communities may feel that, as I said, this is a developer's charter, and given that you've used economic circumstances changing, how many applications do you think, Minister, would actually be subject to changes in economic circumstances for these conditions being revisited?
That would be absolute speculation that I wouldn't want to indulge in at this stage. I don't think that this amendment would then lead to a flurry of applications, but what it would do is ensure that those going through the process don't have what I see as an extra burden that doesn't add any value to the system for either objector or applicant.
Can I ask, Minister, in terms of if we pass this today and it goes through the process in Parliament, will there be monitoring of this to make sure that the kind of disadvantages that colleagues have concerns about don't actually occur?
Of course, there is one aspect of the planning system. All aspects of planning operation and monitoring remains under review, because I'm very focused on delivering a plan-led system, improving performance, delivering development, streamlining and simplifying the system, and taking community opinions on board. So there'll be ongoing monitoring of both applications and the planning system to ensure that it's fit for purpose. And the nature of the system, as you would expect, no less. So we'll consider the impact of this change, of course, Convener.
Are there any other questions in this one? Margaret Mitchell.
I think really, summing it up, Minister, what we're concerned about is the unintended consequences of what seems a reasonable proposition, in which case I hope the Local Government Committee will continue to monitor this, and all members in the Parliament, from their local knowledge of what's happening with planning applications and maybe for these variations, will also bring information to the local committee to make sure that we haven't created a loophole that wasn't intended.
Minister, do you want to move on to the next one, please?
Okay, thank you, Convener. This draft order relates to applications with a right to local review of a decision rather than a right to appeal to ministers. Local reviews were introduced in 2009 and apply where an application is for local development and is delegated to an officer for decision. The aim is to put both types of case through subject to local review and those to appeal to ministers on the same footing with regard to time periods for challenging failure to determine an application. Currently, applicants can seek a local review if the delegated officer takes more than 2 months to determine an application. However, seeking such a local review is currently time limited. This means that where an applicant waits for a decision from the officer, he or she could lose the right to local review on the grounds of non-determination. In such circumstances, they would simply have to wait until the officer eventually issued a decision on the application. Alternatively, rather than lose that right, the applicant might seek such a local review despite the fact that the officer's decision may be imminent, needlessly starting a separate decision-making process. Currently, where a right to appeal to ministers on the grounds of non-determination applies, the applicant and planning authority can agree to extend the period for determining the application and retain the applicant's right to appeal on the grounds of non-determination. This avoids losing such a right or pressure to exercise it prematurely. This draft Public Services Reform Act order would allow such an extension to be agreed where the right to local review on the grounds of non-determination applies. Therefore, where the applicant is content that the more time is required, they could stay in the application process for longer rather than starting a local review process, while retaining the right to challenge the failure to determine their application if a decision is not forthcoming after the extended period. The vast majority of consultation responses supported the proposed change. I'm happy to take questions on this draft order, and I hope that's clear.
Are there any questions for the Minister on this one? No, thank you. Minister, do you want to move on to the next one, please?
Finally, Convener, this draft order again relates to amendments around the introduction of local review procedures, which replaced appeals to ministers in certain cases. It makes a number of clarifications and improvements to the way existing planning mechanisms apply in cases where a right to local review applies, avoiding potential uncertainty about how the system works. The changes involved are very technical. A number of the amendments clarify how mechanisms which specifically refer to appeals or appeal decisions apply where local reviews or local review decisions are involved. For example, provisions allowing planning authority to return repeat planning applications in certain circumstances, including where previous applications were refused on appeal. Again, I'm happy to take questions on this draft order.
Thank you, Minister. Are there any questions for the Minister on this one? In which case, that completes agenda items 2, 3 and 4. Can we move on to agenda item 5, which is the debate on the motion to approve the Public Services Reform Planning Pre-Application Consultation Scotland Order 2013, on which we have just taken over oral evidence. Do any members wish to speak in the debate? No members wish to speak in the debate, in which case, Minister, can I invite you to move motion S4M 5247?
I move.
Thank you, Minister. Can I ask the committee if they agree motion S4M 5247? Agreed. Thank you. That motion is agreed to. If we could move on to agenda item 6, and that's a debate on the motion to approve the Public Services Reform Planning Local Review Procedure Scotland Order 2013, on which we have just taken oral evidence. Do any members wish to speak in the debate? No, in which case, can I ask you, Minister, to move motion S4M 5246?
I move.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee, are we agreed on motion S4M 5246? Agreed. Thank you very much. That motion is agreed to. If we could move on to agenda item 7, and that's the debate on motion to approve the Planning Etc. Scotland Act 2006, Supplementary and Consequential Provisions Order 2015, 13 even, sorry, on which we have just taken oral evidence. Do any members wish to debate? No, in which case, Minister, can I ask you to move motion S4M 5245?
Move the motion.
The question is that motion S4M 5245 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much, and that completes that. And we move on to agenda item 8. And I've just lost my place here. Excuse me a second. And that's consideration of negative instrument, the Town and Country Planning Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations 2012, SSI 2012/325. Members of a paper from the clerk setting out the purpose of the instrument. The Sub-Ledge Committee had no points to raise to the attention of the committee. Do members have any comments to make on the instrument? No comments. Are we agreed not to make any comments on the instrument to the Parliament? Thank you very much. Could I suspend for 5 minutes until we allow witnesses to change seats? Thank you. Can we move on to agenda item 9, which is Public Services Reform and Local Government Strand 2, Benchmarking and Performance Measurement. Can I welcome Ronnie Hines, past Chair of Solace, and David Martin, immediate past Chair of the Society of Local Authority Chief Executives, who are about to give us evidence today on this. Gentlemen, we've been waiting to hear from Solace on this for quite some time. Would you like to make some opening remarks?
Thank you, Convener. I believe you have a note that was provided towards the end of last year which gave you an update on various aspects of this. So we've agreed a little division of labour between David and myself, and I thought we might use that as the script and give you an update point by point on where matters currently stand, if that's satisfactory.
That's grand.
Okay, well in that case I'll cover the first two items, which would be data and the various workshops that we are still running on this, and then David will come in and cover dealings with the Accounts Commission and the timing of the publication of the information itself. So in terms of the data, I'll keep this short for members' attention. The data is now all in, as the note previously said. What we've been doing since it was all received is quality assuring the data. So there's been a fair bit of work going on, and still to some extent at the moment going on, just to quality assure that data and make sure that it's accurate, reliable and robust. It remains the case, as you've been previously advised, that because of timing with the provision of some of that data to various departments of the Scottish Government, it won't all be available when we publish the information towards the end of February, but we've recognised that from the outset and we just have to go with what we have at that point. In terms of the workshops that you've been advised of, there was one held, I think it was in November of last year. There's another one being held on Monday of next week. That will be with what you might call the practitioners, i.e. the people within local government who are expert in these subject areas. And the purpose of that will be threefold really. It will be to talk about the way in which we would want to see this data analysed, and although to some degree that will vary between councils as you would expect, we're trying to put some common denominators down there so that comparable forms of analysis are applied to the data, so the comparison point carries on beyond the data itself. We also want to talk about the way in which the data has to be interpreted, because it will have to be interpreted both within councils and for public consumption. And then finally, the way in which it will be reported, and there's a draft that we now have of the first look at the public performance reporting aspect of this. So we're seeking consistency between councils in all of those areas: analysis, interpretation and reporting. And that's where we currently stand, both in terms of the data and the context in which it will be taken forward.
Okay. Thank you, Convener. If I could pick up from that. One of the things that you're aware from maybe our previous conversations was the close working we've tried to evolve and develop with excuse me, the Accounts Commission and Audit Scotland, and in particular to get the Accounts Commission to have confidence, I think, in not just the quality of the data and the project, but also the sustainability of it, so that this will continue and evolve as we roll forward in years. And as you recall in previous conversations, the main reason for that this is about supporting improvement in local government and local services, and also trying to encourage public scrutiny of the performance of councils. And I'm pleased that the Accounts Commission got to the stage where, in issuing their December direction, that they did feel it appropriate to ask councils to take full account of the SOLACE benchmarking indicator project in their statutory performance reporting in 13-14, which I think is an important milestone. So that was a helpful, I think, conversation. We're continuing to talk to Audit Scotland about the sustainability of the data and the improvement service, so that we do provide ongoing information on benchmarking for Scottish councils. You'll recall also in previous discussions that we talked about the right time of publication, and we had hoped to produce the initial report by December. I think on reflection, we recognised that perhaps the end of February was a better timescale for that. One, because of the point I made about the Accounts Commission direction. The second issue, of course, is that all councils were producing their own individual public performance reports at the end of September, and many local authorities also produce community planning performance reports of various types over the next month or so. So we believe there was a bit of a clutter effect if we launched the project at that point. But perhaps more importantly, building a sense in the Scottish media and with COSLA and a variety of other stakeholders that this was something that we wanted to get proper scrutiny of. We believed at the end of February was a good timescale for that. It's the immediate aftermath of councils producing their budgets, which is another newsworthy item in terms of media and scrutiny. And it also, coincidentally, is when COSLA's annual conference is at the start of March. So we're hoping to align, well, we will be aligning the publication of the document with COSLA colleagues and the Improvement Service and with full support of the Accounts Commission at that time. So that's the issues on timing and the work we've been doing with Audit Scotland and the Accounts Commission. So hopefully that gives the committee an update on what we've been doing over the past couple of months on that.
Thank you, gentlemen. Obviously, we've had evidence from others who have been involved in this process. I wonder if you could give us an idea of what Solace's role has been at each stage of the project from its inception to the forthcoming launch.
Yes, I mean, in essence, Solace has led this project. This has been, the idea, if you like, originated within Solace, so we've led the project from the start. We've commissioned the Improvement Service, as you know, because they've given evidence too on a number of occasions, for the obvious reason that the name says what it does in the tin. This is quintessentially, we think, a piece of improvement work, so why not use the vehicle that was created for it, and they have some of the expertise that's been brought to bear on it. But Solace has had leadership and ownership of this since the beginning, and that will be the case when the data goes public. Part of the communications plan will be to make sure that there's representation from Solace and from COSLA as well, so that the public face of local government, if you like, is closely associated with this when it becomes a public matter.
Thank you. In terms of the interaction with other key stakeholders, which also you've touched upon already, I wonder if you could maybe give us an idea of the interaction that there's been, particularly with the Accounts Commission and COSLA. You've already touched on the Improvement Service. If you've got anything to add about them, I'd be grateful for that too.
Okay, Convener, I'll start with the comments on the Accounts Commission and COSLA. We've worked very actively with the Chair of the Accounts Commission, John Bailey, for 18 months now on this project, and with the Controller of Audit in Audit Scotland. And I think both the Commission, the wider Commission members, when I presented to them with the Improvement Service in November, and the Chair, have been very clear that they welcome the fact that this is effectively self-evaluation and that the project's been driven by local government. And I think that one of the key messages that Accounts Commissioners certainly gave to me when I was giving evidence to them, as I say, back in November, was a fairly tough time about, well, is this going to be sustained? Is this a flash in the pan? And I think they were particularly keen to make sure that it wasn't, as are we, because, as you know, there's been a lot of effort over a period of time to try and get to where we are today. We have to make sure that we sustain the collection of the data, the analysis of it. We continue to improve the indicators because it's quite clear that the first tranche of indicators are a best and reasonable fit in terms of a snapshot of performance. One of the things we hope, and the Accounts Commission hope too, is that we'll get public response to this, and perhaps that will lead to perhaps additional indicators or perhaps an evolution of indicators over time, but maintain a core of data that allows the media, individual communities, MSPs, any stakeholder who's interested to have a really good understanding of what's going on in Scottish local government across the wide range of things that we do. So the Accounts Commission, I think, have been very supportive, but also critical and professional in clearly their view of this, because they've reserved the right in the direction, and I think rightly so, that if they don't believe that what we've promised in the tin is delivered, then they'll come back potentially with another set of SPIs. We've worked very hard over a long period of time to argue that the approach the Accounts Commission's had to SPIs ought to be much more about self-evaluation. They've, if you like, held up their end of the log. It's now up to us to do the same. Maybe perhaps Ronnie might want to mention the work that's being on with COSLA and the Leadership Board.
Yes, it was probably a year ago that we took a report on the project as it then stood to the COSLA Leaders Board, because by then we were beginning to see that clearly there was something to be discussed here. We'd spent the best part of 6 to 9 months just asking the question, could you put a project like this together? By then it was obvious that we could. So we took it to the COSLA Leaders Board. I haven't got the dates, Convener, I apologise, but about a year ago, and they were very supportive of it and have been ever since. So we've been back to them on at least one further occasion. to get further support. And the discussions that I referred to earlier in terms of communications when the project goes live, they've also involved COSLA very actively. So there will be a role for COSLA leaders to play as part of that, as well as Solace.
Maybe you could explain to the committee the difference between the COSLA Leaders Board and the leaders' meetings that take place at COSLA.
Yes, the COSLA Leaders Board is a smaller subset of the wider COSLA Leaders meeting, which by its name involves all 32 council leaders in Scotland.
How many folk make up the COSLA Leaders Board?
About 10 to 12 from recollection.
Okay, thank you. Margaret Mitchell?
Good morning, gentlemen. In your opening remarks, you covered some of the reasons for the further delay in the publication of the benchmarking information. I think it was the clutter, the statutory performance reports that were coming in, and some other report. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that? You noted, I noted you said some Scottish Government data wouldn't be published to the end of December. I think that was school consensus type data, but I appreciate more information. And just to find out if that can now be included, that data that was available at the end of December, now that there is this delay to the end of February on publication.
Yes, the updated position that I'm aware of in terms of some of the indicators that you're obviously you've been alerted to. I received a text this morning, as it happens, or an email rather, with the school leavers destination. So there's an example of something that's just come in at this point in time. And I don't think I would seek to attribute any blame for that whatsoever. We knew when we took this on that the data that we would rely on would be coming in at different points in the year. So you just have to pick a point when you think it's right to go public with it and have the best information available at that time. As we go forward, the realisation, of course, is that it would be better if things were converging at the right time. So we are in active discussion with Scottish Government colleagues about how some of the processes that give rise to the data could be tuned in more finely to what we're trying to do here, and they're very sensitive and very supportive of trying to do that. So as David said, it's the best fit that we can make at the time. I would say that something like 95% of what we want available will be available when we go live. So the assurance I could try to give the committee is that there won't be any huge glaring deficiencies in the data that we publish.
So I suppose the next question is the end of February date now in tablets of stone? The decision has been made and you're going live with that no matter what?
Yes.
Excellent, that's very good news. I wonder if you could maybe give some more information about the challenges and the difficulties that you've had to deal with throughout the development process. And I suppose the biggest question that I suppose the committee would want answered is, has there actually been a buy-in at elected member level and at officer level?
I think the journey has been long, there's no doubt about that, and I know the committee are well aware of that. The answer to the buy-in question is a really serious question, is absolutely. It's not just yes. There's not a chief executive or leader of any Scottish council who doesn't want to do the best they can, particularly in the current resource environment, for their communities. And there's a recognition, and I would actually argue a passion in most parts of Scotland for trying to use this information diagnostically to help contribute towards that journey. There are, as always, when you start trying to do things collectively and you start trying to do things assiduously, there are obstacles you have to overcome. They've tended to be about data and the clunkiness of things that have been out of step, not about culture, attitude and commitment to this particular project. We call it the Solace Benchmarking Project, but it's a local government improvement project. And certainly my view would be that all leaders, the leadership board that the convener referred to did consider the report, but it was also submitted to the full leaders meeting and they all endorsed it unanimously. So there's strong political leadership buy-in to this, as well as chief executive and senior officer buy-in to it. We've argued for this for some years now. I think it's important now that we've got it, we make it fly. So I think I hope the committee will enjoy looking at constructively and critically over the months and years to come is what this information tells us. The only other point I would like to make is that although it hasn't been formally launched, we are using the information at the present time with various local authorities. I mean, I'm doing some work with Dundee City, for example, based on an analysis that suggests they've got some of the same challenges as we have in Renfrewshire. That's happening all across Scotland.
very encouraging. Mr Hines, anything you'd like to add?
David's covered it well. The only little vignette I might offer is that my own council leader is very exercised about this, very, very interested, and I think he's typical in that regard. So I've shared on a confidential basis, because it isn't yet public, a flavour of some of the comparisons that you could make between, in my case, Fife and other local authorities. And as you would hope and expect, as a political leader, he sees the value of this, and I'm pretty sure that will be true across the country.
Okay, thank you for that. One of the advantages of undertaking this exercise was that it was hopefully going to cut down the number of returns that local government is required to give the Scottish Government and other bodies. Has there in any way been a kind of backtracking on that aim, given that there is now a delay in the publication, i.e. returns that you might not have had to have done had it been published in December have now had to be submitted?
Not that I'm aware of, because most of the data is based on the local finance returns that councils generate in any case. The Scottish Household Survey is the other major source of information, and that's continuing to be produced. So I don't think this has added to the administrative or return burden as a result of any changes to the timescale.
Next question. Thank you.
Before I take in Stuart Stevenson, you've said that chief executives and leaders of councils have bought into this. I would say that there are times where chief executives and leaders of councils don't get their own way. How are you going to ensure that other elected members buy into this?
We'll all do different things, I dare say. We are 32 different councils. So the first point to make is that there's an awareness amongst the chief executive community that we have to have those discussions within our organisations. If I give an example from my own organisation, we have a meeting periodically of what we call the cross-party leaders group, which isn't the best name because they're not always cross. But nevertheless, all the members of the political groups get together for discussions on subjects of mutual interest, and at the agenda of the next meeting of that group, there'll be an item on benchmarking. I've already made all the political group leaders aware that this is coming, but we have to have a discussion about how, as an organisation, politically and managerially, we will respond to the publication of it. And I would imagine that similar initiatives, if you like, are taking place across the country.
I thank you for that, but how do you make sure that initiatives are taking place in every single council to make sure that every elected member knows why this is being done, the benefits, the possible benefits of doing this, the value of actually undertaking this scrutiny, because I think it's all fair and well having buy-in from chief executives and leaders. But, you know, in terms of scrutiny on audit committees and other committees of the councils, if the members are not aware of why this is being done and what can be got out of it, then, you know, it's fair and well doing it, but it might not have the benefits that we all hope it will have.
I think that there's obviously a risk of that. I think my sense to the committee would be it's unlikely to pan out that way. I think that the information, when it's produced and benchmarks every Scottish council and families in due course of like councils, if you can do that, that's a challenging agenda in itself. Leads all politicians, regardless of whether, speaking of my own authority, they're a backbench opposition member or the leader of the council, they want to know how their authority is doing in relation to other local authorities, and that will then lead, I think, to enhanced scrutiny, more questioning from both elected members and also from members of the public. The other thing is that there is, of course, a statutory framework to this now because of the Accounts Commission direction, which is always helpful. It shouldn't be the reason we're doing it, but it's certainly a helpful collar, if you like, to the process. And I think elected members generally, because of the struggles, frankly, that administrations and oppositions are having to deal with and have had to deal with for some years now in terms of resources, want best value, and this data set will help address some of that. So I'm speaking from my own authority's point of view, mostly, Convener, but from talking to colleagues, they all think the same way. Final point perhaps might be that this is a work in progress even when it's launched, and the continued dialogue at leaders' meetings, at COSLA, a whole variety of training and learning events, the data and the project will permeate those, so I think there'll be an ongoing interest in what the story tells us, and I'm very confident that will happen.
I'm glad to hear you say that training events will be used to permeate the information. However, would it not be an idea to maybe have some kind of roadshow throughout the 32 local authorities, not necessarily their own folks dealing with the training, but others going around and saying, this is why we're doing this, this is the benefits that it could have, this is the part that you've got to play in this process.
I think I mentioned the workshops that we've held, the next one being on Monday of next week. That's partly the purpose of those. So it's to generate that increased awareness and understanding of what this is about at the relevant levels in the organisation, and the role of the people who come to those is to be the emissaries of this when they go back to their own local authorities. So that's partly how we're addressing that.
I've got two supplementaries in this, Stuart McMillan and then John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. It follows on actually from the Convener's question, and I would suggest, in terms of going forward, that with the councillors who were elected for the first time in May of last year, that they may well actually be one of the kind of the first groups of councillors to be targeted, so to speak. So A, that they're just new in, and B, that they really have to try to pick up a lot more information in such a short space of time as compared to others. But they may be more willing and receptive to this particular piece of work, and it may actually be beneficial for all 32 councils because of there's kind of a new and enthusiastic bunch of people who have just been elected.
I certainly agree that newly elected members are certainly that, but I wouldn't want to suggest that leaders were somewhat dyed in the wool, resistant to change and not keen. I know you aren't. Forgive me for being slightly light-hearted about it, but one of the things that I think's been a really good signal of this project is how quickly leaders have got behind it, and because they're committed to the same improvement agenda as chief executives and all council officers are. So I absolutely take the point, though, that new elected members should. It's a good opportunity to continue the development journey that they're on, and we will take that opportunity.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. I don't want to fully disagree with my colleague, Stuart McMillan, but I think my perception would be some of the longer-standing members of the councils that might benefit more from refreshing their knowledge of what we're trying to do with this process. You have made reference to the events that have been held, the event held in the end of November and the event being held next week, in terms of council representatives attending these events. Could you give an indication of what type of council representatives have attended the event in November and what representatives are likely to attend the next event? Because it would be interesting to just get a flavour of who's actually going along to these and whether or not we are getting a cross-section of the elected members turning up to these events, because it is important, as the convener has indicated, we need to get beyond the council leaders debate and really get that debate within the local authorities themselves, so that all elected members have a buy-in to the process in some shape or form.
Just to clarify then, the purpose of the workshops is not for elected members. Therefore, essentially the policy people within local government whose role comes closest to what this benchmarking project is largely about. So they're typically analysts and other people who will use data on a routine basis in support of service improvement. And that's simply a practical matter, because for all 32 councils, getting together a group of people is something of an undertaking, so we couldn't extend it into all these services as well, because then we'd be talking about a gathering of hundreds. So I referred to these people as emissaries, but they're officers and not members. So in relation to members, it goes back to the comment in response to the convener's question, which I think is right. We have a role of each of us to make sure that, in my case, 78 councillors are fully briefed on this before the information goes live and becomes public. We'll all do that in different ways. But when we do that, the purpose will be to make sure that they're able to scrutinise effectively using this kind of data. So I don't want to be in a position as Chief Executive of presenting for the very first time to a group of, let's say, scrutiny committee members the data that we're talking about and saying, here's some useful tools that you might use the next time you have a scrutiny committee meeting. I'm taking them through that in a more measured way so that they become aware as we go of the nature of this project, the kind of data that's available, and how they might want to fit that into the scrutiny. So there's a process of induction going on separately with elected members, but the workshops are not about that.
I'm grateful for Mr Hines' clarification in the definition of council representatives. But I'd go back to reiterate the point the convener made earlier. It would be useful for the committee to know that the induction training that was being provided by the 32 local authorities was being taken up by every elected member, so that every elected member did have the opportunity to understand where this process is coming from, where it's intended to go, so that every elected member is fully aware of what we're trying to achieve with this. And it would be useful if, either through Solus or COSLA, if we could get some feedback as to what training programmes are in place in local authorities, and also who's participating in these training programmes, because I know that there are training programmes provided by local authorities, and not every elected member avails themselves of the opportunity to participate in those training sessions.
Convener, I think the point's well made by the committee, and this ultimately has to be owned by all 1,223 elected members in Scotland. I think to give you the reassurance that, firstly, although local authorities may do it slightly differently, that it will be part of the core learning and development activity for all elected members of Scottish councils. I think that might be through seminars, for example. The other thing to give you assurance of, though, is that for me, the main result of this project is to turn it into business as usual. So effectively what we end up with is, to give you an example, those indicators that relate to children and young people on the benchmarking project are reported every 6 months to the Children and Young Persons Committee, which of course is politically balanced and is scrutinised on an ongoing basis. And you could reflect that across all areas of the data. And I think we will achieve that. It'll take a little time, but we will achieve that regular scrutiny of activity. So all elected members will see, understand and value the data. That's not instead of formal training, it's in addition to formal training. And I think that those two things together will lead us to a place where we'll be flat in, I hope, in the rush for greater scrutiny and deeper understanding of what this data is telling us.
Yes. Stuart Stevenson, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I want to talk a little bit about indicators and families. First of all, I note what Mr Martin said, that the indicators we have are the first tranche best and reasonable response. And Mr Hines said that they represent 95% of what we want is going to be available. So in that context, I want to just explore a little bit whether we think the indicators have sufficient coverage that are sought. In particular, I identified previously, and this fits in again with what Mr Martin said, that the data set will assist best value, but noting that the indicators do not cover procurement, which is a very substantial part of the expenditure undertaken by local authorities. What plans are there to extend and prioritise the extension of the indicators?
I think that the procurement issue, of course, there are national best practice indicators in procurement that are analysed not through the Solus benchmarking project, but are collected and analysed by the Public Procurement Reform Board. And I would say one thing, this isn't the only, of course, form of data collection analysis that local authorities are involved in. There are a whole suite of them for different purposes. But the question remains, we've always taken the view that getting the project launched successfully would then lead fairly rapidly to a process of evolving it. And our feeling is that, and it's a judgment, our feeling is that the range of indicators we have, and having developed that conversation with the Accounts Commission over the past year, it's good enough for now. And the intention is that we'll continue to evolve the data suite. I mean, for example, there's a major public sector reform agenda around health and social care integration. I think one of the debates is, do these indicators adequately cover that? Of course they don't, and I think there's a need to then reflect how you would evolve in that particular area. So it's, we believe it covers local government reasonably well. It covers the services that we know from feedback from the public people are most concerned about and are most interested in, and it's on that basis that we've launched the project, but we're under no illusions that it's not a perfectly crafted creation yet. And the point I made about sustainability of the data, Solus will keep an active interest in this as we move forward. It will be on our office bearers' agenda regularly. In fact, it's a standing item on our office bearers' agenda at the present time. We'll be developing our discussions with COSLA officers to make sure that we've COSLA itself is taking its full role in the benchmark indicators project, and of course the improvement service which is a creature of local government, will continue to provide support. And although we've yet to pin down the exact nature of it, Audit Scotland have indicated that they're willing to produce some resources to help us with both the rigour of future data collection and helping of the physical number crunching of the project itself. Final point I should have made earlier, and forgive me, Convener, for not doing so, is that one of the reasons for ongoing dialogue with Scottish Government colleagues is to make sure that we narrow the window between when all the data is available and it's published, because a historic time lag of this data is unhelpful to everybody, and we're trying to get the data out as quickly as we can as a result of that. You put all those things together, I think you get a sense of how we're going to try to continue to evolve the benchmarking approach we've launched.
Macmillan, and we have a brief supplementary on that.
Sure, thank you. Just I thought Mr Martin's response there was very interesting, and it just struck me that obviously, I mean, this is an evolving beast, and that there probably will be changes every year. So, what do you anticipate? What percentage of the data sets do you anticipate will actually change on an annual basis going forward? So, obviously, if legislation passes here and things are different, it's not going to stay the same forever.
I might have a go. I don't think I can answer that question in specific terms. The best answer I could give is we need to be flexible about that and respond to circumstances. So some things may come in and some things may fall out, and I think that's just the open-ended approach that we would have to take to this. Just to add to that and a little bit as a supplement to the question that Mr Stevenson asked, at the beginning, we took a strategic decision on this, which was not to try to overload the indicators with everything that we could find that could be measurable in this area. We wanted a broad spread of all services. So by itself, of course, that suggests that it will be susceptible to change over time, because we haven't tried to populate each and everything. But what we really thought was important about this, and which I think we're beginning to see the fruits of now, is that by doing that, first of all, we made the project manageable, and secondly, we established the principle of benchmarking. It's the practice of benchmarking that's really important here, not the specific indicators. We've done our best to choose the right ones, and we may change those over time, but embedding the practice is fundamental. And there's two ways in which I see that going forward. One is that we will deepen this, because these indicators by their nature are very high level, but beneath them there lies a great deal of activity that was already taking place within individual services, education, transportation and so on, and we now see the connections being made between that data which was episodic and something that's much more structured and coherent that sits on top of it that will drive it for the future. And I think that deepening is a very significant part of the project, but also an extending of it into other areas. And I know that in evidence previously the Minister touched on this when he talked about community planning and outcome agreements. So back to my point about embedding the practice. If you embed the practice, you would hope that that would by itself extend into these other areas, but certainly that is the intention. So we think this is applicable for single outcome agreements because you've got the same raw materials. You've got things that are broadly comparable across Scottish local government and the wider public sector, and the practice would then be driven into those areas.
Stuart Stevenson, please.
Clearly, the data are important, and without the data being captured and then normalised and compared, you can't start the benchmarking. But in the discussion, what we're hearing about is the data, and we hear very little about the benchmarking. And in particular, what you're going to use it for. Is the selection of these indicators sufficient to capture sufficient of the activity and fundamentally expenditure that is undertaken in local government to lead to the comparisons that you're going to make and learn from, i.e. the benchmarking, to lead to the kind of changes that are step changes rather than merely incremental ones? Because if you're undertaking the major investment of time, effort at every level in what is a very significant project, presumably we're expecting significant outcomes.
We certainly hope so. I think that the questions in several parts, the range of the data and the reach and coverage of expenditures we think is sufficient. The issues about secondary school expenditure, adult social care, children's expenditure are the big chunks of money in local government, and those are covered by the data, by the indicators. The important point to make too is that because the data is the indicators are based on the local financial returns, that data is collected year in, year out. So even if we do evolve the project, the raw data is still there for the ones we originally looked at. So it is possible to track over a long period of time, and I sense that's one of the reasons behind the committee's questions in this. If it moves 20% every year, in 4 years' time you've got quite a different set of benchmarking data from where you started. I don't think it will be that level of magnitude of change in terms of evolution, but the raw data is all there in a time series form that allows us to come back and look longitudinally at any area. I think the issue of step change and transformation is much a matter for the individual organisations as it is for the benchmarking project. What you do with the data is primarily a matter for individual councils and increasingly, I would suggest, through community plan partnerships, community plan partners.
Can I just come in, because you seem to be stressing the longitudinal comparison, whereas I would have thought benchmarking was horizontal comparison.
It's both and.
Aye, but which is really the driver? In other words, is benchmarking, as you understand it, and the use of these indicators, about one council in one area of activity identifying that they could do better because they can see someone similar who is, and therefore learn? Is that what benchmarking is when you talk about benchmarking?
It is both, but I understand, I think, the point of the question. We've had longitudinal data for quite a period of time now, so we are all each individually capable of seeing whether we're on an improvement trend or not compared to where we were last year or earlier. And that, I think, has taken us so far in terms of improvement. The added value about this is quite specifically the latitudinal comparisons, and the combination of the two is quite potent as well. So the novelty, if you like, of what this brings is very much the latitudinal. And again, I could just give a flavour because it might help with to convey the power of this. If we sit, as we are doing, as David said earlier, and look even at the information that we have at the moment before it's perfectly refined, I can look at my own council and see that the costs that we're incurring for looked after children seem disproportionately high compared to other councils. I could never see that before. I could see that they were coming down year on year, but I couldn't see whether that was sufficient. And of course, the budget pressure tells you that it would be ideal if we could reduce them further without any discernible impact on the quality of the service. So that's just an example of the power of the latitudinal comparisons that this gives you. And I think when that becomes public and when it becomes routine, as David put it earlier, that will be a real step change in improvement.
You clearly, too, have a closed set of 32 discrete councils. What steps are you going to take in future to extend the ability to benchmark outside the set, perhaps with other local authorities elsewhere in the UK where the similarities might be reasonable, or beyond where the similarities might be more difficult to establish?
Yeah, I mean, have a go first on that. I suppose my honest answer is we should walk before we run.
Oh, yes.
And the first step in that would be getting the benchmarking families in Scotland established, because that's a piece of work that we haven't yet fully addressed. And that's how we embed the practice, as I put it earlier. So there's quite a piece of work to be done to get that sorted, and I can come back to that in questions if members are interested. But yes, the point has already been made in our earlier discussions that for some councils it may be the case that the most obvious comparators lie out with Scotland. Some of the city councils probably would take a view like that. And nothing that we have done precludes that, but our focus up until this point has very much been getting this well established. Again, I come back to my point about practice. Once the practice is embedded, I would expect to see naturally people will say, I could see more value or additional value arising from comparisons with a city in England as opposed to a rural council in Scotland.
Perhaps finally, Convener, if you could help us understand the work you're doing on families, which I understand initially to be finding appropriate groupings that are reasonably comparable within the 32 councils.
Yes, we've done some analysis quite recently that indicates, to me anyway, that the best way to take forward the work on families is to recognise that the data itself requires to be filtered. So what do I mean by that? If you look at the educational attainment data, what we find is the correlation analysis that we've carried out so far tells us quite unequivocally that over 50% of the variation in attainment between the 32 councils can be directly attributed to social background factors, deprivation in particular. But it's nice we all know that intuitively, but it's very good to see it established quantitatively by that kind of analysis. So that suggests that for some families, the way that you'll choose your closest kin will be who's nearest to you, if you like, on the deprivation scale, if I can put it as crudely as that. And that will then mean that to benchmark with those families, you will probably address the more personal services like education and social work. For others, however, if you're looking at the more infrastructure type services, roads, transportation, waste management and so on, the factors that have the strongest correlation with the performance turn out not to be deprivation, but they turn out to be urban sprawl or otherwise. So geographical factors, if you like. Now, there's not, when I say that, it doesn't sound like rocket science, but when you see the measures, they're absolutely unequivocal. So you might have a different family for those purposes. Initially, we thought any one council will be in at least one family, and you'll talk about everything in that family. But it probably doesn't make sense to do that because you'll be having the right conversation with the wrong people. So we probably have to think a little bit again about that without overcomplicating it and having groupings of families, 2 or perhaps 3, each council with 6 or 7 peers.
Convener, could I make one very brief point, because I'm conscious of your time, and that is that it's right and appropriate that benchmarking family groups are part of this agenda, but most chief executives and all leaders want to know who's best at everything, and I want to know how we get there. And I think that may, the benchmarking family issue is a contextual issue. It may give you some helpful insights as to the pace of change you can achieve and what can be done. But if it is the case, for example, that Murray Council is doing something interesting for the bottom quintile of attainers in secondary school, I'd like to know what it is. And if the benchmarking indicators pop that up, is it then transferable? So I think you'll see a whole trading floor approach to this going across Scottish local government, which I think is very healthy.
Supplementary on this from John Wilson.
Just on the benchmarking families, and just to try and find out where we are in terms of the benchmarking families and whether or not local authorities have bought into the concept of what family they go into and where they go into in terms of the indicators, because clearly, as Mr Hines has indicated, some local authorities will be in one family in relation to educational attainment, others may be in different families in terms of social work, deliveries of services. So what discussions are taking place with local authorities and the individual departments to ensure that they feel they are in the right family when you're doing these measures?
Well, the analysis that I referred to a moment ago has only recently been done. So we'll now bring that to bear by taking a paper to the next Solace branch meeting at the end of this month that will put some suggestions forward along the lines of what I've said this morning. And the value of that, I think, certainly has been for me, is that the data, or the analysis rather, really speaks for itself. So it should take some of the difficulty out of the discussions, because you would expect that if we try to impose family groups on 32 councils, there will be resistance to that, and we're not in a position to do that in any event. We're a professional association and we don't run the 32 councils. There has to be some voluntariness about this. But when the information presented suggests to you quite clearly that the commonality between you and 6 other councils is as stark as it is according to deprivation or geographical factors, I think that conversation will be a much easier one to have.
On that basis, Mr Hines, how long, what's the timeline to get these families established? Because while we know you're saying the data will be released next month, the information in terms of how you do the comparisons across families will be interesting for many local authorities and individuals within these local authorities. So what timeline are we looking at in relation to getting these family groupings established?
The answer is there's not a specific timeline for that just now. We took a decision last year to postpone the question of the family groupings because we wanted to give absolute priority to the publication of the data. So we're now coming back to that in January, and we will establish a timeline at the January meeting, but I haven't got that now, and I couldn't give it on behalf of all 32 not having had the conversation.
John Pentland, please.
Morning, folks. Now that the date has been identified for the launch, is a committee to assume that local government is ready to meet that challenge? And obviously, when the launch does take place, there will be challenges, especially, key political and media challenges. What will Solus' role be in dealing with them?
You're right, there will be challenges. I also think there will be quite a lot of opportunities, but you're right to identify the fact that there will undoubtedly be some media and external interest in this. I think that's positive. I think that in the current climate, even if we weren't in the current financial climate, it's important to be able to be accountable for variations in service performance across Scotland. It will promote several debates, the two main ones being one person's postcode lotteries and another person's local variation policy choice. I think making that explicit is a good thing, and we'll have those discussions, no doubt, at a local level, a regional level and a national level. You asked, are we ready for it? As ready as we'll ever be. And I think there's just an inevitability about needing to respond to the queries that the media and citizens and communities will ask. I think that the issue of Solus's role is, as it has always been, I mean, it's a Chief Executive Professional Association, but we're also responsible for, Chief Accountable Officers and local authorities, and we're clear that where the buck stops for performance improvement, and we're all professionally and personally committed to that, so we'll play that role professionally. I think critically, though, we talked about the COSLA conference and the fact that there's an opportunity here for it to be seen very much of the local government family and politically led. And points that members made in earlier questions indicated the importance of that. And I would expect politicians locally to be in the van of making responses, conveners and leaders to queries that will come from the press about why is this the situation and what comments would councils wish to make on that. I'm hopeful, I'm a glass half full kind of a person. I'm hopeful that once the immediate burst of interest in that has passed, and it will happen, we get down to the improvement agenda. And I think part of the challenge here will be that local government needs to be as good at putting the improvement stories into the media in a positive way as perhaps we'll have to be in responding to the immediate media burst of interest in what might be some negative information. I believe the third estate in Scotland is possible at accentuating the positive, and we're going to try our best to try and do that.
No, obviously, while the focus will be in local government at the launch, do you think there's any other key organisations could play a part at that launch? And do you think there may be a role for the Scottish Government or the Scottish Parliament?
My answer to that would be yes on both counts. We are certainly hopeful in terms of the Scottish Parliament that the engagement that we've had around this project with yourselves will serve the project itself and the improvement agenda in good stead when we come to that stage in the proceedings. And we have had discussions with senior civil servants around this too, in terms of not just the project itself and its sustainability, but also how we deal with issues around its launch and any media or public interest that might generate. So we've worked quite hard to make sure that the key stakeholders, if you like, including the Scottish Government, are well cited on this, in order that there's no divide and rule game played when some quite difficult information becomes public.
Other key organisations?
For example, other parts of the public sector, you mean? No, nothing in terms of the launch of the information itself. Perhaps a comment in terms of the longer perspective on this. Some of what we're trying to do here is already in place in other parts of the public sector. It's not very prominent or high profile, but there is good data, particularly around the health service, as you might expect, because it's a universal and largely uniform service that's provided, so they do have good data. We would look to see in the longer term a coming together of that, not just because of the point that's been made earlier about community planning and single outcome agreements, but also in terms of mutual support.
Anne McTaggart, please.
Just to add on to what you'd finished off there, speaking to Citizens Advice Bureau and about the information that they're now collating may also be a useful resource as well, given that they all go into the one computer system now and have that data nationally known. So good morning to you. It now feels like afternoon or maybe evening. Take you back, I know you had mentioned earlier about community planning. Can I drill down a wee bit more on that, and just to hear what you think the implications may well be for the project on the community planning partnerships?
I think positive. One or two of the indicators are cross-public agency absence and attendance, for example. So I think there's an immediate opportunity to do some of that work on corporate indicators across public sector organisations and, for that matter, third sector organisations in the private sector, perhaps, in local community plan partnerships. I think the point that Mr Hines made about bringing this into single outcome agreements is a really powerful one. And if it's the case that there's a quite clear community plan guidance now on what the national priority areas are for outcomes and measures and milestones, I think what we'll end up with when community plans are submitted to Scottish Government and discussions and agreement takes place, we'll have a fair degree of consistency of the local outcome indicators and measures over a 3-year period, which then, if we've built confidence, as Ronnie said, we walk before we run, but if we've built confidence on the benchmarking approach, might then lead to benchmarking across like community plan partnerships on the range of indicators that we've mentioned. And I think that the pilot work that Audit Scotland are doing just now on 3 community plan partnerships is exploring that. So I'm optimistic we'll end up taking the philosophy and approach here into community planning partnerships as well.
So currently, what kind of work is Solace doing with community planning partnerships just now, or is it just the Audit Scotland that are working with the pilot projects?
Certainly, all 32 chief executives are at the centre of the community plan partnership process in their own local authorities with their political leaders. So at the local level, we're in it up to Rocksters. I think if that's the nature of the question, I think more generally, Solace has been a strong advocate of community planning in Scotland for many years now, and we're very committed to trying to make sure that the current approach is as successful as it can be, including comparison of performance in time between partnerships themselves.
I think our focus at the moment is on proving the concept with this piece of work. I think that's really important, and once that's done, then we can move confidently into discussions with a wider set of people, particularly around community planning. But even in advance of that, we see connections between this kind of work and some of the work with which the committee is no doubt familiar that's beginning to arise in response to the general public service reform agenda, the 4 pillars, including work around prevention. So just as an illustration of what I mean by that, if you look at some of the work that we see coming forward in relation to early years, I think that lends itself very readily to this kind of approach too, because increasingly the view is that there is a science around this, not necessarily an absolutely precise science, but nevertheless a good one, and that suggests that there's a standard somehow that should be met in terms of interventions for early years. So the data that's being gathered around that particular area should be nationwide data, and again, you can see the argument beginning to mount. If we've got nationwide data, if it's being collected and acted upon consistently across the country, then you'd expect to see benchmarking as part of that. If some areas are making more progress than others in relation to early years, we want to know why. And the benchmarking approach is a good way of finding out. So we're not at that stage yet because these 2 agendas are running concurrently, but at some point in the not too distant future, I see that they will come together.
Hopefully soon. Yep, thank you.
Thank you. John Wilson, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. Just a couple of follow-up questions. There has been reference to the benchmarking process being to allow local authorities to evaluate the cost of delivery of services. And Mr Martin made reference earlier to best value for local authorities. Could either Mr Hines or Mr Martin give a definition of best value? Because when we took evidence from COSLA last year, which was only in November, I think, Councillor Cook, representing COSLA, indicated that some local authorities may make decisions to deliver services that may seem or appear to be a higher delivery cost than comparable services by other either local authorities or other family groupings for the delivery of those services. How do we get that message over that local authorities are not purely looking at the benchmarking process as a way of comparing cost of the delivery of services, but are using that to deliver best value to the communities they represent, not using best value as the cheapest delivery mechanism?
David?
Start having a go at that, Convener. I think that best value is statutory definition in legislation is about continuous improvement. But I think that the issue for us is it's silent on choice. in terms of the statutory definition. I think that an important element of the benchmarking approach has been quite explicitly to have indicators that measure cost and outcome or output. So, for example, if we're looking at the cost per primary or secondary school pupil, that sits alongside information on attainment and achievement of pupils at the local authority level, so that you get a much more rounded picture and therefore a much better debate and discussion about what the levers for change and improvement actually are. And when you see the published document, and we have a chance to perhaps debate it again in the future, we've tried to theme the indicators around things like children and young people. So I think that one of the reasons why there's so much commitment to this particular approach is that for many years we've been bedevilled by cost-only or input-only measures, and what we're now trying to do is move that debate forward on a wider range of factors that lead to local authorities making decisions. So I think it'll actually assist that challenge that you're mentioning about not just simply knowing, if you like, the cost of everything and the value of nothing.
Thank Mr Martin for that response, and I just get further clarification from in terms of outcomes versus outputs. And I've been around long enough to know that there can be many differences between what is set as the outcomes and what the eventual outputs are. And what measures, in terms of what the Scottish Government are looking for, what local authorities are looking for, what do you think would be the best measure in relation to using the benchmarking tools that are going to be made available in relation to the delivery of services by local authorities? Is it outcomes or is it outputs?
I see no reason why it shouldn't be both, because it is the practice. So you can compare anything with anything so long as you've got the data and you've got the analytical capability and you're clear about what it is that you're trying to achieve. So if what you're trying to achieve could be designated as an output, you can apply it to that. And a lot of what we're doing at the moment would probably be fairly described in those terms. But equally, you can do it for outcomes. And I think that's where we would move on to increasingly if we applied this to community planning, for example.
Convener, I thank Mr Hines and Mr Martin for the responses and look forward to further debates on the single outcome agreements that no doubt local authorities will be engaged in the future with Scottish Government.
Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. Just it follows on from Mr Martin's response there in terms of not just about looking at the cost, about the wider best value. With that being the case, are there any kind of European angles to this? Are there any kind of impediments from Europe, or has there been a kind of a European kind of encouragement angle to encourage ourselves to actually kind of look at this from a different perspective?
We've not as yet taken the benchmarking agenda beyond 32 Scottish councils, and I think it's a fair challenge of what international comparisons can you learn from. In terms of the project itself, we haven't really explored that particular dimension so far, but in terms of benchmarking or learning that goes in, that potentially is being looked at across a range of public policy issues that local government's at the centre of. Mr Hines mentioned early years, for example. A lot of the work that's being done just now between local government, Scottish Government, the Health Service on the so-called Early Years Collaborative is precisely that. It's about looking at international experience and trying to find out what programmes work best across the world and how can those be imported into a consistent application going to scale in Scotland. We haven't, in the benchmarking project, addressed any international comparisons. I think the point one or two members made earlier on was south of the border or in the UK as a whole might be a good next step, and indeed individual councils are doing that. This is about, I think, a good start, and in time I think we'll explore whether or not we can learn anything from other parts of Europe or perhaps broader than that. But I just want to reassure the committee there are many aspects of local government work that is doing that international comparison and being driven by that, just not this particular project so far.
Please.
As both Chief Executives, also you'll be aware that we're living in a financial climate that's not very strong. And so with the introduction of benchmarking, obviously there'll be a bit of a competition could perhaps happen out there. Now, working on obviously a restrained budget, do you as Chief Executive see other services being diluted for you to try and reach the aspiration of one of your family members?
I think that's essentially a matter of local political choice. What the benchmarking project will do is provide better information to allow politicians to make those kinds of decisions. I'm not trying to duck the question, but I think that's genuinely what the data is doing. Officers will make recommendations, but I think one local authority may decide to put a priority on older people, which is greater than another. We may be focusing on children and families, for example. It's a bad perhaps comparison, because that's really the tug of war. But I think that the benchmarking data will assist in helping sharpen up political choices and be challenging to people like myself and Ronnie in terms of trying to work out where the best practice might be or how other authorities are approaching particular problems. I think it will empower politicians to help provide a partial response, a better response to the financial challenges that you mentioned.
To just add to that, I see it having exactly the opposite effect. We're having to make those choices right now anyway, and we're doing it partly in blind. Because politicians are making choices between protecting areas of service that are a priority for the council and of necessity, because of the point that you make about the economic and financial context, something else having to bear a bigger burden in terms of reductions. Now, we do the best that we can to ameliorate the effects of that, but we're doing it without the benefit of this kind of information. So what we could be doing is saying to politicians, if your political priority is, let's say, protection of frontline education service, and if as a consequence there has to be a bigger service reduction somewhere else, let's say transportation, what this comparative data will tell you is there is scope to do that, because we're already sitting, in terms of transportation costs, higher than the average or in the wrong place. Likewise, we could be giving advice about the need to protect certain areas, because perhaps putting the money into it isn't the same thing as giving it a priority. There may well be scope for making efficiency savings in that protected area, just as there are in other areas. This information gives us that insight into all of these choices. At the moment, we're doing it by political decision making, and with some information to hand, this gives us a much finer tool for that kind of comparison. I would hope it protects services rather than jeopardises them.
Margaret Mitchell, please.
Just out of interest, has the proliferation of FOIs sort of helped local authorities to take on board benchmarking? Because in many ways then the question is being asked and comparisons are made across councils in a very rough and not detailed way, whereas benchmarking is going to be done in an organised fashion where the analysis is going to be hopefully spot on eventually.
Gentlemen.
I don't think that FOIs have increased the commitment of local authorities to self-evaluate and self-improve at all. I think it's a context of, encouraging free access to public information. Certainly, in my experience, is that all councils are committed in any case to try to improve services, and this benchmarking approach is helping us, as Ronnie's mentioned many times, to try and do that. Forgive me putting it this way, but it would be surprising if councils responded to FOI, and FOI was the driver for performance improvement in local government. For many, many years, councils have been, continuously improving in a whole variety of ways, and FOI is merely a context, I think. I don't think it's a driver for performance improvement, would be my view.
Slightly, we're maintaining a united front, so we'll continue to do that, but slightly different perspective on it. When we had the debate, when this project started, the intention was it would be information, if you like, that chief executives and their chief officers would use in camera. So I would get information on 31 other councils. I'll sit down with my management team, as David has already described, and say, what's going on here? Why do we look like this and everybody else looks like that? It didn't take us long to realise that that wasn't the most powerful way to use this, that public transparency is actually an essential element of what we're trying to do here. I don't know to what extent our thinking was influenced by the prevalence of FOIs, but it's very much of its time. And so I don't think it took us long to come to a decision. It wasn't a hard decision to reach either. This has to be public, and that's an important part of it.
Thank you.
John Wilson, please.
Sorry, Convener, just to follow up to Margaret Mitchell's question. How much work has been done to make sure that the data collected is comparable across the 32 local authorities? And was much work undertaken to make sure that what is being collected and reported on is actually comparable information, because based on Mr. Hines' comment there, it may be that what you were looking at previously was information or data that was not being collected in the same way, the same manner, the same fashion, and not being reported in the same way. So how much confidence can we have that the data that's been presented will be comparable data?
The short answer in terms of how much work is scoons. We've done an awful lot of work on it, but your question's well put. The challenge, if you like, the test that you have to pass if this information is public is much more stringent. So I do not believe that what goes public at the end of February will be 100% accurate in every respect, because it's the first iteration of a piece of work of this nature. I would be pretending otherwise if I said I thought that wasn't the case. But we will learn as we go. So part of the improvement itself will be any questions that this gives rise to that demonstrate that the data was not 100% reliable will mean that we will make sure it is the next time around. That's what continuous improvement means.
Thank you, Convener.
John Pentland, please.
Chair, if I could just go back to my previous question and Mr. Hines' response, it's when I asked if he thought that benchmarking would, you know, perhaps dilute other services, and I think you used the answer would be that you could see it as something that we could work upon. Are you then saying that if where an authority has a high benchmark in one area and a low benchmark in somewhere else, are you then saying that you know the local authorities would then forgo their high benchmarking here to subsidise their low benchmark?
No, what I'm saying is that having that information allows the choice between those two areas to be made on a more informed basis. But ultimately it's a political choice. So if a council is, for example, sitting at the high end of the cost spectrum for a particular service, and the information shows that, it's nevertheless a choice that the members can make to say, well, that's what we want to do. This information is not telling us that we're inefficient. It simply says that the consequence of the choices that we're making is that we're spending more money on that service. So long as we're not inefficient, we're quite happy to continue to do that. So you can make all sorts of choices. The point is that the information just gives you a better basis for doing them.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your evidence today. Obviously, you recognise the interest that the committee has on this project. We will continue to keep an eye on what's going on. What would be extremely useful for us is once the launch takes place, it may be good if you could actually write to us, let us know what is going on. And in addition, if we could get an indication of the training that's going on at council level, I think we would benefit from knowing that. And I speak for myself here. I don't know about anybody else. I would actually be quite interested to see what is going on out there in terms of the training, if that were possible. That we could come to some mutually agreed times that we can go to somewhere and see what's being done. I would certainly be interested, and I'm hearing other members saying that they'd be interested too. So if that were possible, I think we'd be grateful for that.
Sure, we could arrange that. I mean, thank you for the committee's continued interest in this. It's important.
Thank you very much. As previously agreed, we now move into private session. Can I suspend the meeting for 5 minutes?